The following is a text exchange which occurred between brothers on January 21st, 2021. 7:32 p.m. Iceland has very specific naming rules, which I was reading today because I was wondering what you do with the whole son and daughter thing in an era requiring more gender-neutral naming conventions. These are the names you cannot use for your child. Pedro, Satania, Ljótur, which means ugly, Lothina, which means airhen. I get it. Pedro doesn't use letters in their alphabet, and the other three would apparently lead to embarrassment. But my whole thing is, what's embarrassing about being called airhen?
Is it related to it being too close to Lufthansa?
And Lufthansa being Nazis?
Right.
Icelandic naming is wild. When I write my book about Canadian football and drag queens, I'll try to work that in there.
Alright then.
I'm trying to write a book that nobody's written before.
Sounds like it.
And that nobody will read.
I'll read it. My friend Sally will read it. Cheryl will read it. Bryn will read it. Grant may actually be illiterate.
I appreciate your misguided enthusiasm, but Grant probably has the right idea. Straight from the heartland, this is Things I Text My Brother. Hey folks, and welcome back to another episode of Things I Text My Brother, a series of conversations which have taken place between the brothers Drouillard on subjects spanning the neighborhood and the globe, which will hopefully leave you smarter, kinder, and better looking. Today we're going to jump off from that dramatic reading that you just heard and discuss the topics therein. Maybe we'll talk about drag queens, maybe we'll talk about Canadian football, maybe we'll talk about air hens, but we haven't plotted an exact course yet because we want you to join us on that journey. That's how it works on Things I Text My Brother. I'm Jeff. This is Brad. Let's talk about our texts. But before we dive into this week's topics, we need to take a step back and have a look at past topics because although we may be amongst the top experts on these subjects within our own households, there's always room for us to correct our mistakes and learn more. With that in mind, it's time for Blutions and Edification. So Brad, do you have any ablutions this week?
I have to say I'm feeling pretty good about last week's.
No need for cleansing?
No need for cleansing. Our last show I did pretty well, and we need our listeners to really start chipping in. I'm probably perfect, but I'm pretty sure you're not. So surely they have more things for you that they haven't been adding to our Instagram page or wherever they're listening to the podcast and letting us know what we've got wrong.
I think the one thing you and I can almost certainly agree on is that I am not perfect. But I actually do have something to add this week, and it goes back to our Pancakes and Waffles episode, and it's all about people's names not getting changed when they came through Ellis Island. And I told the story about a man who went to Houston, Texas when he was actually supposed to be meeting family members who had come over previously on Houston Street. And I knew that it was named after a different person, but I had never actually thought about, okay, if it's not named after that person, which person is it actually named after? And so for this week's edification, I finally took the time to learn about William Houstoun, Houstoun, somewhere that extra U got lost. But he was actually a delegate to the Continental Congress at a time when Sam Houston would have been a wee little whippersnapper down in Tennessee or wherever he was originally from. So this William Houstoun, this Scottish guy from an aristocratic family, he was marrying the daughter of another man who was fairly prominent in New York City. And that other man, Nicholas Bayard, decided to name the street after William Houstoun. Eventually it becomes Houston, and there are still people confusing the two to this day. I'm sure there is an ablution to be taken from that little bit of edification I attempted, but at least we've tried to learn something. With the ablutions and edification out of the way, it's time to talk about this week's topic. And Brother Brad, we're going to lead it off like we always do. What do you want to discuss first?
If there are naming rules in different places, and there are, so we're talking about Iceland, and we have naming rules in the United States. There's certain names you can't have. Certain states don't allow diacriticals like Lucia and Jose and Amelia.
What is this word you just used? Diacriticals?
Diacriticals, so the accent marks.
Oh.
So if you think of the accent mark on Lucia on the I, and Jose on the E, and Amelia on the E, right? Or Amelie, I guess that'd be Amelie.
Yeah.
Some states don't allow that. So there are different rules in different states, and they don't generally allow names of proper business names and things like that. You couldn't name yourself Google necessarily or Microsoft.
I wouldn't name myself Google. They're the only people who can't get our podcast posted within like 3 days of us putting it up.
I would say, even if there are not committees or organizations that really dive into the naming like they have in Iceland and some other places, there are rules in lots of different countries. But I could find about 13 that had strong sets of rules and strong sets of names that you could have. None of them as few as the 1800 names that they have in Iceland.
1800 total?
One gender, I can't remember which gender, and the other one was even less. It was 1800 and 1600 were the totals that they had. But it made me wonder, in the episode where we talked about unthanks and unthank manor, there was the guy who changed his name to Dixon Dixon. I do wonder if he would have been allowed to do so with the strict rules of Iceland.
That's a good question. One thing I do know, according to an article on some website called Culture Trip and a writer named Jessica Jones, in the United Kingdom, you cannot be named Monkey. In Australia, you cannot be named IKEA. In Australia, you can also not be named Dickhead. In New Zealand, you can't be named Queen Victoria. In Sweden, you can't be named Elvis. In Mexico, no James Bond. Portugal can't be named Nirvana. And of course, we know that in Iceland, you can't be named Airhen. But I thought it was worth mentioning all of those.
Did you run across, when you were looking for names you couldn't have, did you run across an article about New Zealand?
No. What did you find out there?
There was a small child, a female child, named Talula Does the Hula from Hawaii.
Oh, and I did see her name. She just went by K or something.
She went by the letter K. Just the letter K, not K as in K-A-Y or anything, but the letter K. Yeah, Talula Does the Hula from Hawaii. Judge Rob Murfitt said that was cruel and unusual, so he made her a ward of the state long enough that she could apply to have her name changed and then resolved the custody battle. So he intervened to let her change her name before she was old enough to do so herself.
What was her name again?
Talula Does the Hula from Hawaii.
And did she have a last name?
I don't remember if she did.
Because if she was Icelandic, she would have been Tula Does the Hula from Hawaii Jorgensen.
Yeah.
Or Björgen's daughter. Yeah. That's a great name. They might have done her a great disservice making her change that name, but I leave it to the government of New Zealand to make better judgments than me.
Judge Murfitt went on a rant, though, and talked about how other parents are cruel, and he cited some other names that he thought were cruel and unusual. There were twins named Benson and Hedges, which is a cigarette brand. There was a child named Midnight Chardonnay, and there is one still named Number 16 Bus Shelter.
Wow.
And that is nothing against Number 16 Bus Shelter. Whoever you are unique and own it and love it. I got nothing against it.
I want to live in a world where Number 16 Bus Shelter and Tula Does the Hula from Hawaii meet somewhere and decide to stay together forever. And what would they name their children? That's the world I want to be in.
Just so you know, the number 16 is actually the numeral, not spelled out. So it's number 16, 16, Bus Shelter.
That is good to know.
Yeah.
I guess we should be happy, though, that some of these protections exist, though, because even though the Number 16 Bus Shelter would be a great name, as would Tula from the Hula of whatever, those would be great names. Well, Germany has obviously banned the name Adolf Hitler, but guess which country has not? It's these United States of America. And in fact, there's a couple from New Jersey who named their 3 children Adolf Hitler, Joyce Lynn Aryan Nation, and Heinrich Hans, named after Heinrich Himmler. So, I guess I'm going to go back on what I said before. If these judges are protecting their people, their children from being named names like these, I guess they have the right things in mind.
If these naming committees, like in Iceland, the Mane Napna Nemt, I'm going with that. I'm going to go with it. Mane Napna Nemt. If these naming committees really are looking to benefit the children, they're looking out for their social well-being and their mental well-being at an early age. There is actually some research behind that, of course. I'm sure they've done. Mm-hmm. But I did find some research from the Social Science Quarterly, and the article that was in there was First Names and Crime, Does Unpopularity Spell Trouble? So in this context, unpopularity is around the popularity of the actual first name. So not, I was not very popular in high school. That's not what they're talking about. But Brad is
there's always next time.
Brad was a relatively common name, even though there were no other ones in our high school. So they did a study around the popularity of names and they gave it a popularity name indexed value. So how often the name was a first name. And it went from 100 for Michael down to 1 for names like Ernest. And David was 50, a PNI of 50, somewhere in the middle. So a level of how often the name appears. And they correlated it with the percentage of individuals with that name that are also juvenile delinquents. There's a lot I'm uncomfortable with this study, right? But they did try to control for race and ethnicity, and really were socioeconomics really were the biggest driver. So no matter what race or ethnicity you were with the name and the popularity of the name, the values were about the same. But what they found was that with every 10% increase in popularity of a name, there was a 3.7% decrease in the percentage of delinquents with that name. Not of the overall population, but of the population of individuals with that name. So using the Social Security Administration site in our birth years, in your birth year, Jeffrey was ranked 190th. And in my birth year, Bradley was ranked 52nd, which means my name would have had a higher PNI and yours a lower, which would have resulted with you having a 40% more likelihood of being a delinquent based on your first name alone.
And yet you're the one who stole the geese around the town of Elmore.
Put them in a certain person's yard.
Take that, statisticians. What do you know? I didn't do anything.
The tan van was good at hauling things, and they could haul lots of stone geese.
I actually looked into the original question which I had asked in the text, which is, what's going on with all these sons and daughters now that we live in a world that is much more inclusive, much more fluid in terms of gender identity and sexual identity and all these different factors? And in fact, Iceland has already answered that question back in the year 2019. They did make some changes, such as, for one thing, Icelandic given names will no longer be differentiated as being male or female in the National Registry. So you can name anyone, well, not Erhen, because Erhen is still not an approved name, but you could name anyone Bjorn. You could name the girl Bjorn, the boy Bjorn, or somebody who didn't identify as either male or female or whatever the case may be. The Gender Autonomy Act also gives individuals the right to change their official gender according to their lived experience and register as neither male or female. What that would mean is on their official documents, rather than male or female, they could just put an X. And rather than having their last name bear the son or the daughter at the end of it, it would actually be graced by the letters B-U-R. But yeah, they've apparently answered that question already, which is pretty cool. And it seems like there were other efforts within that Gender Autonomy Act to try and be progressive in terms of how they were facing gender identity in general, which I thought was a pretty cool thing to find out.
This all makes me wonder, though, if there had been a naming committee in place, how many teams in the CFL do you think would have been named Roughriders at the same time?
I think 2 was the right amount because you had one in the Western Division, one in the Eastern Division, and actually they came out of these rugby associations that were originally very separate. So it wasn't unusual to have your Saskatchewan, or as they probably would have been at the time, Regina Roughriders, before they became Saskatchewan's only team and became the Saskatchewan Roughriders. And then out there in the East, the Ottawa Roughriders, they would have never seen each other on a gridiron field or whatever version of football that they claimed to be playing at the time. So, yeah, it got a little tricky, though. Once the leagues merged right around the time that we're starting to play Super Bowls over here, the East and the Western leagues of Canadian football have formed up into 2 leagues that are doing the same thing in different parts of the country, joining together first just for championship games, kind of like we did with the NFL versus the AFL, or even in Major League Baseball until the American and National Leagues started playing those games across the leagues. But yeah, to have 2 Roughriders out of 9 teams, that does seem a bit of a stretch. I don't know which naming convention would have fixed that. What ultimately fixed it is that the Ottawa Roughriders folded and came back as the Renegades, and folded and came back as the Red Blacks. So for anyone scoring at home, there is exactly 1 team called the Roughriders in the Canadian Football League out of the 9 teams at this point.
And that is Saskatchewan.
Saskatchewan, you got it. And they're they play in the prairie like Green Bay in our league. Their fan support is ridiculous compared to the other teams. It's actually those teams that are out there in the smaller cities have insane levels of support. And it's the teams like Toronto and BC, which plays in Vancouver, British Columbia, and Montreal. They're the ones who struggle to gain the support.
Yeah, I was wondering that myself. So Regina is the 18th largest metro area in Canada. Mm-hmm. With 263,000 people. Mm-hmm. Even if you expand that to 1.17 million, which was the population of Saskatchewan when I looked
Mm-hmm.
The 18th largest metro area in the United States is Tampa Bay St. Pete with 3.2 million. So that was just I was curious what size of the cheering population that would be. So if you put Regina in its place in the United States, it would fall between Lynchburg, Virginia, and Atlantic City, New Jersey, and be the 188th largest metro area in the United States.
Yeah, imagine the entire city of Lynchburg all sitting in the stadium together wearing green and cheering on the Roughriders. And that's kind of what it's like, is my understanding for Saskatchewan. So they have this incredible fan support drawn from a pretty small population. But yeah, the Canadian Football League has struggled at various times to keep things going because of those population realities that they're up against. But those teams have the support for sure. It's kind of like part of the identity for people who live in those places.
There are, 12 provinces and territories in Canada?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
How many of them have a Canadian Football League team?
How many of the provinces have?
Yeah, well, none of the territories do.
Well, Ontario is overrepresented because they have the Hamilton Ticats. They also have Toronto, Ottawa. Then you go up to Montreal and Quebec. So we got 2 provinces so far. They're talking about adding one out in the Maritimes. They haven't yet. And then you have all the big western provinces are represented. So you have Winnipeg and Manitoba. You have Saskatchewan. You have 2 in Alberta. You have Edmonton and Calgary. And you have Vancouver represented in the form of the BC Lions, which the Lions represent the 2 big mountains that kind of frame the water at the edge of town. They're known as the Lions as well.
Interesting. That's 6 of the 12. So that's 50% of your provinces and territories have a Canadian Football League. There's only, 23 states plus DC that have them in the United States. So we're less than 50%. So they have us beat.
I'll take your word for all that. The other place they had us beat is when they, I don't know if they had us beat or we had them beat, when they tried to add a bunch of American teams in the mid-90s. Not the best move. I don't remember where all the teams were. There were Sacramento. There was Baltimore trying to make up for not having the Colts. Baltimore, as the Stallions, actually won one of the 2 or 3 CFL titles in the seasons that American teams played, and a bunch of other teams that disappeared as soon as they appeared on the scene. But I'm pretty pleased that Canada has this thing that it's its own. I love watching Canadian football because it's for an American. It's certainly this niche thing, but there's a passion that's there. Not all Canadians are watching Canadian football. In fact, I saw something saying if you could watch the Super Bowl or the Grey Cup, which, by the way, is the second oldest championship in North American sports, only behind the Stanley Cup in terms of trophies, the Grey Cup is the football championship. And Canadians, 52% said they would choose to watch the Super Bowl. 48% said that they would watch the Grey Cup if they could only watch one or the other. So even though the skill level isn't quite as it is with the NFL, it does have support. It's, when you're watching your own teams, especially out there in the prairies where those are the teams you grew up in the stands with, it's a big deal for those people. And I love the passion part of sports. Appeals to me more than the game part of sports. And I certainly feel that with some of what goes on in the CFL.
I put that into perspective with if you talked about the United States and you were talking about, say, soccer fans, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you gave them the option of watching the MLS championship or maybe the Champions League final, I would imagine that number would be larger than 52-48 in terms of who would choose Champions League over MLS Cup.
I think there's very little doubt, and I'm amongst those. So I'm not entirely sure how we then mesh all that we just talked about with the CFL, along with the Icelandic naming conventions, with the other thing that I mentioned in our text exchange, which was drag queens. But I got to figure out a way to do it because I spend a lot of time watching Canadian football. I spend a lot of time watching RuPaul's Drag Race. And I spend very little time talking about Icelandic names. So it seems like I would have to at least build this up with a little bit more of something that I'm knowledgeable about. And that would have to be the drag queen thing. Can you think of any way that drag queens, Canadian football, and Icelandic names come together?
I spent an embarrassingly large amount of time looking for a website or anywhere where someone had taken the time to use NFL players or CFL players or any athlete for that matter and come up with the best athlete names that would also work as drag queen names. And I found nothing, and I was really disappointed because I thought there'd be something out there.
I mean, there's an incredible history with it, and Drag is just like Canadian football. It's probably the first time that sentence has ever been uttered in life, at least in terms of like my approach to it and my interest with it. It's another world that originally was no part of my life growing up in the one stoplight town in the Midwest in the United States. Didn't know about Canadian football, though we did start to get Channel 9 from Windsor and watch some Canadian games. I certainly didn't know about drag queens. And both genres appealed to me for different reasons. With drag, I just find that it's this ultimate outlet for creativity. And I've been trying to think, why I connect with it. And there's something about a common storyline for many of the drag queens is there's often this sense of, especially when they were young, feeling other, feeling like they weren't quite what everybody else around them was. And as cookie cutter as I am, as the straight white guy from small town America, I don't think it would shock you if I told you that I certainly felt a little bit other growing up. And I still don't know why, but I got along with people, things were okay. I just felt like I was always a bit of an odd duck and didn't always fit in line with the others. For drag queens, many of them, it's that story for much more serious reasons. They're facing sometimes families who reject them, certainly classmates and towns that often didn't connect with their interests and sometimes were very harsh with them. But I can really appreciate people who take something where they didn't feel like they were a part of what everyone else was and turn that into some kind of creative outlet and make something great out of it. Now, I don't know if I've achieved that yet. I think that's part of why I write and what I do with my writing. I hope that even if I'm writing nonfiction, I'm saying something creatively with the words. And that's what drag queens are doing. It's this ultimate form of expression. Now, put some shoulder pads on, which drag queens have probably worn shoulder pads at various points, but put some linebacker shoulder pads on them and come up with the name. There's got to be something there. And the person who would be able to think of it would be a drag queen because they can come up with the most ridiculous, wonderful, amazing names. But yeah, there's a makeup called Rouge, right? That's a type of makeup that exists, yes?
It is. There's a type of makeup called Rouge. It's another way of saying blush.
Yeah, I was guessing it involves putting some redness on your face. Okay, there's also a term in Canadian football called a rouge. It's a single point that can be scored when a team kicks the ball into the end zone. Let's say it's a missed field goal, but the defense catches the ball in the end zone. They need to return it out of the end zone. If they don't, the kicking team gets one single point. Something that doesn't exist in American football, but that is called a rouge. So I think that's our bridge. We need to take a drag queen. Maybe if she was Canadian, even better, because maybe somebody would understand this whole rouge connection up there.
Does she need to be French Canadian?
Well, I guess rouge is probably a French word, isn't it? Yeah. It's red.
Says the French speaker.
Well, not really, but I did take 8 years of French, and I should know that rouge is red. But there you go. Yeah, so that's the bridge. We have to have somebody named something Rouge daughter or something like that who can put on shoulder pads, run around in probably an Ottawa Red Blacks uniform or a Calgary Stampeders uniform, because both of those would offer red. So would the Montreal Alouettes, I guess, with the Rouge. Maybe that would be good as well. And Alouette, of course, being a lark. But yes, all of that would work. So there's the bridge. Now all I have to do is write that book for an audience of probably just about as many people as who are listening to our podcast. This other thing that I love about exploring these topics like Canadian football, last year I was just looking into this one player, and soon I was learning about Canadian history in terms of how they treated Canadians with an Asian background. And it was really interesting to see how those things developed in other parts of the world, how Americans treated different immigrant groups, how Canadians treated different immigrant groups. And there's just always these different opportunities to learn. And actually, even in the realm of drag, I'm a person from this one stoplight town in Elmore, Ohio. Finished college, I haven't been anywhere, but all of a sudden I start learning about people from all these other places and just their experiences in life have so much to offer. And, I already know about Marsha P. Johnson and Stonewall and some of the basic foundational elements of understanding the gay liberation movement and the HIV AIDS epidemic in New York actually was my experience first going to the city, had to do with a camp, which was volunteering with families affected by HIV and AIDS. And so I really started to learn about a world that was bigger than the one that I had grown up in. But I also just today learned even more, and I came across this incredible story about this guy named William Dorsey Swan. And I actually want to mention the guy who wrote the article. His name was Channing Gerard Joseph. He was a student at Columbia when he was doing some research, I think about 2 decades ago now. And it was basically just this was stuff that he uncovered, and certainly would deserve credit for basically revealing this character of the world. William Dorsey Swan was born in Maryland. He was born, well, into slavery. It was 1860. So of course the Civil War ended soon after that. But he came from that background, and eventually he moves into Washington, D.C., as many Marylanders would, and a lot of former enslaved Americans did move to Washington, D.C. And in the 1880s and 1890s, he's holding these drag balls. And anybody who understands drag culture knows about it, knows that in New York City, we get into the 1970s, there are these drag parties, these balls where people are walking, and well, Madonna took a little bit of that with the voguing and all of that, but that came out of a culture that already existed, and there would be drag families. So a lot of these people who didn't necessarily fit in with their real families, they come to a city like New York, they find other people who've had similar experiences in life with them. They get decked out, generally as men getting decked out as women and participating in these drag balls. And it's just a big deal. It's culturally a big thing. There's a great film about it called Paris is Burning. But that didn't just happen in the 20th century. I found out that this former slave, William Dorsey Swan, was throwing drag balls like this in Washington, D.C. in the 1880s and 1890s. And actually, the guy that I mentioned earlier, the writer, he found this all out. He was just doing some research, and he was reading newspaper articles from 1888 about these gatherings. As you can imagine, when the police found out about these gatherings, they didn't go well, and these parties would have been broken up. There was actually an event which echoes some of what happened in Stonewall, which, if anybody's not familiar with Stonewall, it's where the people in the bar in New York City, police came in to break up a gathering of mostly gay men, and they started fighting back. And it was this huge moment in the gay liberation movement of people starting to fight back and not accept this. But I was so interested to find out that this was even happening in the 1880s. One of the first incidences of this happening was amongst Swan and his friends fighting back. And he was pretty upset that his gorgeous dress of cream-colored satin was torn to shreds that night. But actually, he continued to hold these gatherings, and every once in a while they were getting broken up. But it's pretty cool to think of this thing that a lot of Americans, maybe still to this day, haven't quite come around to, although I think more and more people have, and RuPaul has certainly helped that happen. But it's cool to think that there were people engaging in these beautiful forms of expression over 100 years ago, throughout all the challenges and different things that would have made that difficult to do. Swan's brother actually continued to make drag clothing for other drag queens for next half century after all this. It was alive and well. And this resurgence of drag culture, people dressing in drag is not necessarily a new thing. There are actors in Shakespearean plays dressed up in drag, and Peter Pan was a woman. It didn't just suddenly emerge in the world. And it's just been really cool to learn that history, especially when it's in such sharp contrast to, what we would have known about and experienced in our childhood in these small places. So you pick up some drag, you pick up some Canadian football, you mix it all together, and hey, we got a world that is interesting and exciting and has new things to offer all the time, and I'm here for it.
Well, I have to thank goodness that when they say things like high school is the best time of your life, or, we don't really evolve. Thank goodness society evolves. Thank goodness high school isn't necessarily the best time of everybody's life, because I certainly didn't feel like I fit in there either. I took a different route, of course, to figure out who I was and what I was. But ultimately, I found my people, the folks that I fit in with, that understood me, that care about me, that I care about. And I love that people do that. I love whatever group that is. You find your group, you find your people.
Yeah.
You make the world a better place when you find that group of people. Now, if you find your group, you find your people, and you make the world a worse place, I have no time for you. But if you're making the world a better place with the people that you found, then I say more power to you. Love it, own it, do it. And I have great respect for the folks who do that, who get that encouragement, who go down that path and become who they really have always been, but didn't know till they found their people.
And you and I are very fortunate in that way, because I think a lot of people have to find their only family. The family that we were born into, was a very supportive, wonderful, and stable family, and gave us everything that you could hope a family would give you. But then you go out and you find that other family, and so many people, and it's even built into the culture of drag. Oftentimes you identify, this is my drag mother. This is the person who brought you in under his or her wings, showed you what this world was, and helped you figure out how you fit into it. And, that family element of finding your tribe, that's there in drag. I guess that's very much there in sports as well. There's certainly athletes who find their place and time because of that. They're maybe not always as desperate to find it, but when they do, it creates a pretty special thing. There are more parallels than I think people would recognize on the surface between those very disparate experiences. Speaking of having a good family, there's one member of our family who we like to talk to every episode around this time. He's not an ordained priest. He's not a member of the Icelandic naming committee, which is called, Brad?
Mane Napna Nemt.
Exactly. Nor has he ever played football for any football team known as the Roughriders. But he is our Father Art, and we're going to ask him some questions.
Do you think the name Air Hen is appropriate for a child? As in, Air Hen, Arthur's daughter.
Sure, why not?
As a writer, can you think of any narrative line which your son, Jeffrey, could use to write a book which features the Icelandic naming conventions, drag queens, and the Canadian Football League?
I'm sure he could come up with something, particularly in regard to the Canadian Football League. I would like to see Jeff do the Icelandic football cheer.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. If the Icelandic football cheer is your favorite football cheer.
Well, it certainly is right up there. I like, it's not exactly, it's more rugby than football, but I like the Maori chants and cheers and hakas. That probably would be number one.
Even more so than Liverpool's "You'll Never Walk Alone"?
I despise that.
You do?
I don't like that. It makes about as much sense as playing Abide With Me at a soccer game.
Well, folks, now that we've heard from Father Art, it means that our time together is coming to an end for another episode. We've said just about everything we can say about sons, daughters, Rouge, Roughriders. What's her name?
Talula Does the Hula from Hawaii.
Talula Does the Hula from Hawaii, the number 16 bus stop, and juvenile delinquency. But fear not, there will be another episode coming your way just as soon as we can dig back into the archives and find another gem of a text exchange and do just enough research to pretend we know what we're talking about. In the meantime, you can head over to our Instagram page at Things I Text My Brother Podcast to drop us a note about what you liked or what you didn't like, or to tell us something that we got totally wrong. Then hit the like button or subscribe button and tell a friend, an enemy, and a total stranger to come and give us a listen. If you manage to do any of that, the fraternity of Drouillards will be forever grateful. But most importantly, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Which one of you, what was the deal with the broken window?
The broken window or the broken back door?
I was going for the back door. Are there multiple incidents?
Yeah. Well, the back door was, we were playing that baseball game on Front Page Sports Baseball on the computer.
Which is nowhere near the back door.
And Ben beat me, which was just galling because he knows nothing about baseball. And I'd played that game a million times, and somehow he beat me. And so I was chasing him through the house with a rolled newspaper. No, I mean, Ben could have kicked my ass at any point in time in this fight. I was chasing him through the house, and he shut the back door, and I went right through it. And he was standing on the other side, and he caught all the glass, like in his face and his hands. He's bleeding from his face. He's bleeding from his shoulders, his arms. He's got one stuck in his leg. There's all this glass sticking out. I'm just standing there and like, oh my God, I killed him. Because he's just staring at me, bleeding. And he's like, I think I might be bleeding. I said, yeah. So we ran into the bathroom, and I'm like, should I pull the glass out? He's like, I don't know. So we called his mom because mom wasn't home. I didn't want to call her at work because she would have been angry. So we called his mom, but she wasn't home. So Delinda answers. We're like, Delinda, what should we do? I don't know. Ben's bleeding. So I don't know how old we
I was
were.
going to ask you.
Probably like 3rd grade or something.
Really?
So I got on my bike and he sat on the handlebars because Delinda said, take him to the doctor's office right now. So he couldn't walk because he was like losing blood. So I sat him on my handlebars and rode him to the doctor's office with him bleeding all over the place. And we stopped at Grandpa's on the way there. I don't know why I didn't call Grandpa because he was home. And so he carried Ben over to the doctor's office and talked to the doctor and the nurse and stuff. But yeah, it was terrible.
I'd like to
It
see
was terrible.
video documentation of that bike ride. I'm sad that it doesn't.
We're standing in the bathroom. I'm like pulling glass out of him. I'm like, I don't know if we should be doing this.
Wow. That sucks. I just know I could have done better. I gotta rub my nose. My arm is a tissue. My arm is a tissue. Ready? Brad, you've gone silent.
I got lost there.
So I will not be in the state of Ohio next Thursday. So we will return to recording in 2 weeks.
All right. Well, you'll have to remind me because I'll forget.
Yes. And
there are some things I'm good at, but you're keeping track of your schedule. I'll never remember.